Awful discouraging. You know, we do our very best to grow a good crop to feed the world, and then we can't hardly give it away.
It's harvest season in the Midwest. Wheat, corn, soybeans, they're all booming, but instead of celebrating, farmers are now facing what some are calling Farmageddon. Why?
For more than 50 years, this land, these endless waves of wheat have been America's pride, the symbol of abundance, the grain that built empires, fed nations, and filled the bellies of half the world. But one quiet morning, as trucks rolled into African ports and American farmers waited for their export orders, nothing came. No ships were unloading, no calls from Lagos, no contracts from Nairobi. Africa had gone silent, and within days, Washington realized something unthinkable had happened. Africa had stopped buying American wheat. This wasn't just trade politics. This was rebellion wrapped in flour, baked in silence, and served on the world's plate. For decades, U.S. agribusiness controlled what Africa ate, how it farmed, and who profited. Loans came with conditions, seeds came with patents, food aid came with a flag. But in 2025, that quiet control began to crack, and when Africa said no, it didn't just reject wheat, it rejected the system behind it. They told Africa it couldn't feed itself. They said without American grain, millions would starve. They forgot one thing. Africa is not the same continent they met 40 years ago. Across the Sahel, new irrigation systems now feed thousands of hectares once left to die. In Kenya, farmers use AI to track rainfall and yields. In Nigeria, youth-led cooperatives are turning cassava into export-grade flour, and in Ethiopia, the same land that once defined famine wheat fields now stretch as far as the eye can see. The narrative flipped overnight, the hunter became the hunted, the buyer became the seller, and Washington didn't see it coming. You see, food is not just about feeding people, it's about feeding control. When you decide who eats and when, you decide who survives and who obeys. That is why America's wheat exports to Africa were never just business, they were power. But Africa, through pain and patience, learned the system, learned the politics of grain, learned that dependency is the quietest form of slavery, and when it finally broke free, the shock wasn't just economic, it was psychological. Washington's think tanks called it a supply chain disruption, but in Africa, people called it something else: freedom. For the first time in decades, African nations stood together not as aid recipients, but as architects of their own survival. Nations like Tanzania and Sudan began producing hybrid varieties resistant to drought. Egypt expanded its wheat corridors with Ethiopia, and Nigeria's new agro-currency project allowed farmers to trade grain digitally without touching a single US dollar. Every grain of wheat grown on African soil became a statement that Africa was done being the world's client. It was ready to be a competitor. The American response was predictable. Articles appeared overnight. Russia is exploiting Africa's wheat market. China manipulating African agriculture. BRICS food strategy threatens U.S. farmers, but behind the headlines was fear. Fear that Africa was building something Washington couldn't control, and that fear more than any lost contract was the real wound. For years, the U.S. used its wheat to buy loyalty. Now Africa is using its soil to buy freedom. The irony. America taught Africa how to play this game, but Africa learned too well. Now the student has surpassed the teacher and the teacher is terrified. Because it's not just wheat, it's fertilizer, it's currency, it's data, it's control. Africa has started localizing production, integrating supply chains, and linking regional markets. The African Continental Free Trade Area is becoming more than paperwork, it's a living organism, feeding 1.4 billion people with African-grown food. And each harvest season chips away at the myth that Africa can't stand on its own. There's something poetic about it. The continent once branded the world's basket case is now becoming the world's breadbasket. The same soil they once said was too dry, too poor, too unpredictable now producing record yields. And somewhere in America's heartland, a wheat farmer looks at his idle silo and whispers, "Africa doesn't need us anymore." He's right, because Africa has found its rhythm not through aid, not through debt, but through unity. The truth is, Africa never lacked potential, it lacked permission to grow its own food, to control its own markets, to reject help that wasn't help at all. Now that permission has been reclaimed, not asked for, but taken. And this time the world has no choice but to listen. From the Niger River to the Nile, from the plains of Zambia to the farms of Morocco, the sound of harvest is the sound of defiance. Each sack of grain shipped within Africa is a message to the West: we're done being fed by your fear. That bread, simple, warm, unbranded, represents more than food. It represents sovereignty. It represents a people who have finally understood that food security is national security, and when you control your food, you control your destiny. So the next time someone in Washington asks why Africa stopped buying U.S. wheat, tell them this: Africa didn't just stop buying grain. It stopped buying dependency, it stopped buying silence, it stopped buying a narrative that said it could never win, because the moment Africa took control of its food, it took control of its future. And now, the world is watching hungry, confused, and afraid as the continent that was once fed learns to feed itself and everyone else.
The story begins quietly. No breaking news alert, no White House press briefing, just a line buried deep in an agriculture report. African wheat imports from the United States dropped by 72% this year. No one in Washington wanted to talk about it, but across the Midwest from Kansas to Iowa silos are filling up, and farmers are asking the same question. Why did Africa stop buying? Because for decades, Africa was America's guaranteed market, a continent framed as hungry, dependent, grateful for Western grain. That narrative just collapsed. Picture a Kansas farmer, boots dusty, staring at endless golden fields. Every harvest season, half of his wheat was packed onto ships bound for Lagos, Accra, and Mombasa. Now the ships aren't coming. Export orders canceled, prices falling. Washington calls it a market adjustment. But inside the farm community, the word is betrayal. What they don't realize is this: Africa didn't betray America. It simply woke up. It started after the Ukraine war reshaped global trade. Russia and India began offering cheaper grain. No political strings attached. China financed new African grain storage hubs and rail lines, and African governments from Egypt to Nigeria began asking a dangerous question. Why do we need to import food from a country that tells us how to vote, who to trade with, and what policies to adopt? For years, U.S. wheat was bundled into aid packages. Food for peace, they called it. But behind every shipment was a clause, a dependency, and a leverage point. When Africa wanted to subsidize local farmers, Washington warned that violates free market rules. When Africa sought to build grain reserves, U.S. economists said, buy instead, it's cheaper, yes, until it cost sovereignty. By 2024, a new pattern emerged. African nations began signing barter deals: wheat from Russia for fertilizer, wheat from India for minerals, wheat from Brazil for coffee exports. Suddenly, African ports were filled not with U.S. ships but with vessels flying BRICS flags. In the eyes of Washington, this wasn't just trade, it was rebellion. Because if Africa can feed itself or choose its partners, America loses one of its last tools of control: food diplomacy. Behind closed doors, leaked cables from U.S. trade officials reveal concern. Loss of agricultural influence could undermine broader U.S. interests on the continent. Without food dependence, political leverage fades. That's the hidden story. This isn't about wheat, it's about who controls the dinner table of the world. For decades, America used food the way it used oil and the dollar as power. Now Africa is quietly unplugging from that system. Across the continent, something extraordinary is happening. In Ethiopia, local scientists are breeding high-yield wheat, adapted to African soil. In Nigeria, new milling plants are processing homegrown grain instead of imports. Tanzania and Zambia are forming an East African grain corridor, trading wheat internally for the first time in decades. Africa isn't refusing U.S. wheat out of pride, it's investing in its own survival. And Washington doesn't know how to react inside. Congress, lobbyists are pushing panic buttons. Billions in farm subsidies are at risk. Senators from wheat-producing states are demanding hearings. But the U.S. State Department keeps repeating the same line: we're monitoring the situation. The situation, however, is already out of their hands. African nations are not just changing suppliers, they're changing the system. They're trading in local currencies, building regional food banks, and rejecting Western trade rules that once dictated what they could plant, sell, or eat. It's a revolution without gunfire, fought with seeds instead of bullets. Every bag of locally grown African wheat is a declaration: we will not be fed to be controlled. This quiet defiance terrifies Washington more than any protest or coup. Because the empire of food built on aid, loans, and dependency is crumbling from within. Imagine the next decade, Africa feeding itself and exporting to others. The BRICS bloc replacing the U.S. as Africa's agricultural partner, and American farmers realizing the world they once dominated is no longer listening. The same fields that once symbolized American abundance now stand for obsolescence. The power that once shipped hope across the ocean is now watching a continent rise not in need but in control. Washington won't admit it publicly. You won't see it on CNN or read it in the Wall Street Journal. But the truth is spreading through African grain markets, through local cooperatives, through leaders who've had enough. Africa didn't stop buying U.S. wheat because it couldn't afford it. It stopped because it finally realized the price was too high. And somewhere in the American heartland, a farmer stares at his unsold harvest, wondering how a continent once called the future of U.S. agriculture just became the beginning of its end. A long line of ships sit idle at an American port trust, creeping up their sides. Containers once filled with wheat now gathering dust. The dock workers whisper Africa isn't buying anymore. But the truth behind those empty ships runs deeper than trade. This is about the collapse of an empire built on hunger. For decades, Washington perfected a subtle weapon, agriculture as diplomacy. In the 1980s, when Africa faced famine, America arrived as the savior. Planes dropped sacks of wheat stamped with the U.S. flag. Cameras rolled. The world applauded. But few noticed what came next: contracts, clauses, and commitments. U.S. wheat aid wasn't free. It came with rules that shaped local markets, dictated farming priorities, and flooded African economies with cheap imports that killed domestic production. African farmers couldn't compete with subsidized American grain. Entire generations abandoned their fields, and Washington called it help. But Africa began to see the pattern. Each year, dependency grew. Each aid shipment weakened the soil of independence. By the early 2020s, whispers of resistance spread through ministries and think tanks. Young African economists asked a radical question. If Africa can mine gold and drill oil, why can't it grow its own wheat? The answers came fast and from unexpected places. India sent agricultural experts. China funded irrigation systems. Russia offered grain swaps with no political lectures. And quietly, Africa began to rebuild its farms, one field, one seed, one harvest at a time. In Washington, nobody noticed, or maybe they refused to. Reports warning of African agricultural independence were buried in bureaucracy. U.S. media ignored the shift, too focused on Middle East conflicts and domestic politics. By the time the U.S. Department of Agriculture finally noticed the drop in wheat exports, it was too late. African countries had already signed long-term supply deals with Russia, India, and Turkey. Some had even started exporting small quantities of local grain, and that's when panic hit the American farm belt. For the first time, farmers realized they weren't just losing money, they were losing relevance. At a town hall in Nebraska, a wheat farmer stood up and asked a U.S. senator, "You told us Africa would always need us. What happened?" The senator had no answer, because the truth is America built its agricultural empire on the assumption that Africa would never rise. That assumption just died. With fewer buyers, U.S. wheat prices tumbled. Storage silos overflowed. And for the first time in history, some American farmers began defaulting on loans because African demand had vanished. Meanwhile, in Addis Ababa, something historic was happening. Leaders from across the continent gathered under the African Union banner to launch the Pan-African Grain Initiative, a plan to make the continent self-sufficient by 2030. No Western consultants, no Washington approval, just Africans setting their own rules. They agreed to invest $20 billion in irrigation and seed development, create a regional grain bank to protect against droughts. Trade wheat across borders without Western intermediaries. In one line, a statement read, "Food security must be built, not imported." That single sentence sent shockwaves through U.S. diplomatic circles. And so, Washington did what it does best: it changed the story. Suddenly, Western media headlines appeared: Russian grain. Diplomacy in Africa raises concerns. China weaponizing food aid in developing nations. The goal? To paint Africa's new independence as foreign manipulation. But Africans saw through it. This wasn't manipulation, it was liberation. For the first time, African nations weren't reacting to crises created elsewhere. They were shaping their own destiny. What truly terrifies Washington isn't just lost exports, it's lost influence. Because when you control a nation's food, you control its politics. And without that leverage, U.S. power in Africa begins to fade. Every locally grown ton of wheat, every homegrown seed variety, is a small rebellion against the global order that once treated Africa as a customer, not a partner. And as African silos fill with their own harvest, the old empire of dependency begins to starve. In 2025, during a U.S.-Africa summit, a senior African minister was asked whether his country planned to restore agricultural imports from America. He smiled and replied, "We no longer import food for survival, we grow for sovereignty." The room went silent. Because in that one sentence, the old power dynamic, the one that had defined the U.S.-Africa relationship for half a century, officially ended. So when you hear about declining U.S. exports, don't just think of numbers and charts. Think of the farmers in Africa tilling soil that once lay abandoned. Think of the ships that now sail east instead of west. Think of a world where food is no longer a weapon but a declaration of independence, because the day Africa stopped buying U.S. wheat wasn't the day trade slowed down, it was the day freedom began to grow. Washington, D.C. early morning. The White House Situation Room glows under cold fluorescent lights. Advisors huddle around maps showing Africa's shifting trade routes. The headline on one screen reads, Africa diversifies wheat imports, U.S. market share plummets to record low. The president frowns. It's not about the wheat, it's about what comes after. What began as a trade decision has now become a geopolitical earthquake. As Africa stopped buying U.S. wheat, other sectors started following suit: fertilizers, tractors, even genetically modified seeds. American agro-giants like Cargill, Monsanto, and Archer-Daniels-Midland are losing billion-dollar contracts overnight. But here's what no one in Washington wants to admit. Africa's move didn't just hurt America's economy, it inspired others. In Moscow, New Delhi, and Beijing, the phone lines buzz with opportunity. BRICS nations launch a global food sovereignty initiative offering low-cost grain storage tech, hybrid seeds, and barter systems using local currencies. Suddenly, African nations no longer need US dollars to buy food. They can trade wheat for oil, minerals for grain, and data for technology. It's a new global marketplace, one where Washington's rules don't apply. Unable to control the trade routes, the US turns to its most powerful weapon, the media. A coordinated narrative appears across major Western outlets. Russia is buying influence through Africa's food system. China's wheat diplomacy could destabilize African markets. Africa risks food insecurity without US expertise. But on African soil, a different story is being told. Local outlets report rising yields, youth-owned farms, and a surge in agri-tech startups. The continent that was once portrayed as hungry is now feeding itself. And the world is watching. In rural America, the mood has turned grim. Farmers who once shipped grain overseas are watching their profits vanish. Some blame Washington for overplaying its dominance. Others are simply stunned that a continent they once pitied now holds the upper hand. Africa used to be our biggest growth market, says a farmer in Kansas. Now they're growing their own. No one saw that coming. For the first time, America is learning what dependency feels like when the world stops needing you. In Nairobi, Addis Ababa, and Pretoria, leaders celebrate quiet victories. The African Continental Free Trade Area (AFTA) begins implementing food trade corridors, connecting West African wheat producers with Eastern flour processors. Farmers once marginalized by U.S. imports are now exporting within Africa for Africans. And in a move that stuns analysts, the African Union signs a wheat independence charter, pledging to reach full continental food security by 2032. To Washington, this is an economic shift. To Africa, it's a civilizational rebirth. Here's the part the West fears most. As Africa stops buying U.S. wheat, it also stops paying in U.S. dollars. Trade with BRICS partners happens in local currencies, the yuan or even the new BRICS digital token. Each transaction weakens the dollar's global grip, a currency once propped up by Africa's dependence. And for the first time, American analysts are whispering what was once unthinkable. The de-dollarization of Africa has begun, because food was never just about feeding people, it was about feeding the dollar. And now Africa is no longer at that table. Western think tanks rush to reinterpret Africa's defiance as foreign manipulation. But for Africans, the real story is simpler: self-respect. Every loaf of bread made from African-grown wheat is more than food, it is a symbol of freedom. It's the taste of independence that generations fought for but never fully achieved until now. In villages, families celebrate harvest festivals not as consumers but as producers. In cities, young entrepreneurs are turning agriculture into tech drones, apps, and blockchain traceability for African crops. This isn't just economics, it's identity. Africa is feeding itself by itself for itself. Desperate to regain influence, Washington announces a new partnership for African food security. Billions of dollars in aid and investment flood toward African capitals, but this time few are signing up. Leaders remember what came with those deals: debt control, conditionality. Instead, they're choosing South-South partnerships with Asia, Latin America, and among themselves, and in a quiet but symbolic moment. An African minister says during a press conference, "We thank our American friends, but this time Africa will handle its own hunger." The cameras flash, the statement trends globally, and in that instant, everyone understands the wheat war is over. Africa won. From Washington to Wall Street, analysts scramble to adjust. Africa, once labeled the aid continent, is now dictating market prices and trade routes. The same regions that once depended on U.S. food shipments are now exporting to the Middle East and Asia. America, once the world's farmer, now watches as others reap the harvest. And behind every diplomatic smile lies a quiet truth: the world has changed. The age of agricultural empires is ending. The age of food sovereignty has begun. So when you hear the headlines "Africa stopped buying U.S. wheat," remember this: it wasn't an accident. It was a statement. A statement that Africa will no longer eat under someone else's permission, that food will no longer be a weapon or a bargaining chip or a chain of dependency, that Africa has found its voice not through war, not through protest, but through the soil beneath its feet. And somewhere in a quiet American farmhouse, a lone wheat farmer turns on the news, sees Africa's new grain fields stretching for miles, and whispers, "They did it, because this isn't just the end of a trade deal, it's the end of an era, and the beginning of a new one where Africa feeds itself, and the world finally learns to listen."